The Vortex Razor AMG 1-10 by 24 has insanely bright illumination. On paper, well, there's not a whole lot of information that we do have on paper, but it is smaller and lighter than its Gen 3 1-10 brother.
Pew pew! Pew!
This is also reserved for the military.
Pew pew!
The individual that sent this over, Sean, whose Instagram page is linked in the description below, he's asked me to do that. So this way you could all go check out more on this optic and what he is doing in Hawaii, because that is where this scope hails from. I'm sure if you called him Magnum PI, he would actually love it.
Pew!
Enough of that though. What about this optic?
Pew!
Well, as far as the price point goes, there really is no sort of price point. The only private sale of one of these that I found was on taxswap.com, where the individual sold it for $3,750 along with a Reptilla mount. I've guessed long and hard about what Vortex would charge consumers like you and I
Pew!
if they were to bring this scope available to the civilian market, and it would be at least $3,000. The Gen 3 1-10s are already $2,500, and those are made in Japan. This is assembled in the USA to meet with military contracts.
Pew pew!
So if Vortex ever releases this to the public, expect it to be at least $3,000 to $3,500. If not, probably a lot more. Anyway, as far as how this thing performs down here, illumination is fantastic. The rear lens coatings do a really good job of dispersing lens flare. And the scope profile is not that big. To the naked eye, it does perform much better than this, like a Razor should.
Pew pew! Pew!
On this channel, it seems like I've been getting my hands on a lot of unique and special stuff, which is just the way it happens. If someone sends something my way to review, I'm going to review it, and a lot of it has been special. But nothing as special as this chode of an optic right here. The Vortex Razor AMG first focal plane 1-10, better known as the super short. This optic is reserved for the military. The only way that the individual that sent this in for me to review got it was he spent an exorbitant amount of money for a rifle, I believe from Euro Optics, with this mounted on top. That is the only way you can get one of these in civilian hands. Not many people have reviews on them. There are a few, but I wanted to give you all the first-hand experience of what this is like to actually use. And I'm sure the burning question many of you might have in regards to this is this any better than the standard Gen 3 Razor HD? Well, there's only one way to find out.
And here it is, ladies and gentlemen. The key differences between this and the standard Gen 3 Razor HD are pretty substantial, actually. These are assembled in the USA, meaning that they can be used for government contract. Not only that, it is much shorter. Just how short, you might be asking? Comparing it to a PLxC, if I was to match up the rear eyepieces to the front, you can see it's a good 3/4 of an inch or so shorter. And because this is a 34mm tube versus 30, you can see that's where it gets its chode appeal from. I'm going to keep the PLxC over there because we're going to check out the weight momentarily. In fact, we might as well do that right now. The PLxC was always a lightweight, and coming in at just over 17 ounces on my scale is proof positive of that. This super short is a little bit heavier at 19 ounces, but you got to keep in mind this has a much larger diameter tube, as well as a few other features that the PLxC does not feature. Not only that, you could at least buy this, whereas this, you really can't do such a thing. Anyway, let's start off at the back and work our way forward. You will notice a very fast focus locking eyepiece. This has some of the coarsest threads on any non-fast focus eyepiece I've ever seen, and it feels absolutely incredible. There is zero wiggle to this. It's very tight and hard to turn, and once you get it in the correct position, because this has a lock ring, you twist the two together, and that's it. You never have to worry about your eyepiece shifting on you out in the field. It also cuts down a little bit on weight, and it should add to the overall durability of this thing because there's less means of egress of dirt and debris getting inside the scope. As for the magnification ring, at 12 o'clock we have 1x, and 10x is way over here. This is a very short throw, probably about 120 degrees or so, I would say. And look at how the numbers are spaced. We go from 1x to 4x in most of the throw, then 4x to 10x in that short range. That is an extremely short whoop. Like if you wanted to go to 5x to 8x, it's like a quarter of an inch, if that. I'm going to be curious to see how well this thing is going to respond to such a short throw of such a vast magnification difference. Before we get to that though, this thumb ramp is all I think you would ever need. If you look on top, it goes from about the 2 o'clock position to about the 10 o'clock position. It's perfect. It's going to stay out of the way of any sort of rifle components that you might worry about interference. No such thing here. It feels fantastic. Got a good amount of dampness to it. And there's nothing I could really pick up in there that I don't particularly like. This thumb ramp, I think, is all you'd ever need. So you don't need to put on an extra throw lever on this thing if you're worried about it. Or at least not just yet. As is the case with most Gen 2 and Gen 3 Razor products, we have a locking illumination control. This one, before we get there, has a beautifully inset battery compartment with this wonderful, very hard to turn cap. I am going to use a Vortex product. Look at it. This will actually just like lock in there. Oh, it's beautiful. Going to open this bad boy up. Look at how big that O-ring is. That's going to put pressure on the back of that battery so you don't have to worry about it getting bumped out. Threads on the outside are beautiful. There's an O-ring in this rather large channel. I don't know if that was a design feature or something was wrong when they originally developed this. But I mean, look at the size of that thing. This thing is beautiful. As far as the inside of the battery compartment itself, we have a standard CR2032 battery. It is pretty easy to remove, thankfully, because it's very deep in there. We have 6 fingers that hold it securely to the battery pad, and you could see at the bottom, assembly 2019, revision AA, serial number, all that jazz. Battery goes back in, and the cap screws on easily enough. You never have to worry about this thing coming loose on you if you don't want it to. And the same thing for the illumination control. If you throw this in your bag, you don't have to worry about it accidentally getting activated and killing your battery, because this requires you, well, you don't have to lock it, but you have to disengage the lock to make any adjustments. 11 total brightness settings with offs in between. A little bit of play inside the detent. It's not the best feeling detent in the world. And when you do decide to lock it, you got to twist it a little bit so this way it actually falls into its slot. Not the end of the world. More than serviceable, I would say, because you're going to go from off to on, or to on over here, and then off there. But so far, that's the only thing that I'd like to see improved. Not that anyone would listen to me, but it's nice to say that this could be tweaked ever so slightly. As for the turrets, Vortex was smart enough to have both of these be capped, especially with the reticle that's inside this, the EBR9. There's no reason to have exposed elevation turrets, or exposed turrets in general, because you're going to set this to a 0 and then use the drops at distance. That's the fastest way to get the most out of your optic. And having both of these capped, well, just sort of makes sense. Look at the detail and uniqueness of these turrets. Completely recessed down on top to make them as lightweight as possible. These are non-locking, but you don't need them to be locking because they're capped. And I actually really like how they have the 0 mark highlighted like that. That's a nice little touch that I wish other manufacturers would start doing. Really, really cool. Simple enough windage turret. 1 mil increments. 10th mil increments, I should say. A little hard to differentiate what's what, but if you're making an adjustment, it's easy enough to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, feel it and hear it. Not so much see it, but that's the least of my concerns. Again, this is set and forget, so I'm not overly concerned about that. For your elevation, the same rules apply. 1, 2, 3, 4, 0.5. See, the 0.5 is actually a short one, where I'm so used to most scopes having at least the 0.5 mil mark be slightly high, so this way you can quick reference that, but no such thing with this turret. Like, what is that? It's 0.6, right? 7, 8, 9, 10. Yeah. Sound and feel, not the best, to be brutally honest, but far and away from the worst. I do like this 0 mark, though. I'm going to see what's underneath this cap. Big old O-ring on the outside of that bad boy. Pull that up. And that is all there is to see on the inside of this thing. There's really not a whole lot going on, but it looks really, really robust. Simple and robust. That makes me very, very happy. It's really hard to read because of the coding, but Vortex Optics USA, assembled in USA, patent pending. AMG 1:10x24. Proof is in the pudding. If you're fans of my channel, and you've watched almost all of my videos, you'll know that I'm not the biggest fan of first focal plane LPVOs, especially above 1:8. I think they're really compromised in a number of different ways. And the Gen 3 Razor HD 1:10 is one such scope that I haven't really been super blown away by as an overall package. Yes, there's some things about it that I'm really impressed by, but overall, it doesn't really seem to jive as well as it should or could. Companies like Primary Arms, for example, with the 1:8, I think are doing it as good as you possibly can right now, taking advantage of a slightly lower magnification range, but trying to make the scope overall more usable. Not saying that this is the best scope on the market, but in this sort of magnification range and setup, it's really not that far off from being at the top. So my question for this video is this 1:10 AMG American-made super short razor going to be the one to take the cake? Well, let's stop talking about it and actually find out. I have never been a fan of the EBR9 reticle, nor will I ever be a fan of the EBR9 reticle. You might want to crucify me for that, but my reason is sound, at least in my mind. The posts at 3, 6, and 9 are so short that it makes no sense why they wouldn't just make them full length. The center part of the reticle, the most important part, is transparent, so this way when you're on a smaller target, it doesn't completely block the target, because if it was solid, you wouldn't be able to see a smaller target behind it. It really could be tweaked in a vast amount of ways to improve upon it, but Vortex just doesn't want to do it. You will note here that above 8x, we have shadows creeping in very aggressively. The eye box on this thing is on the tighter side. It's a 1:10 that's very short and fairly lightweight. There's only so much performance that we can expect from a scope like this. In my mind, most 1:10s in the first focal plane have some major flaw, typically with image stability and or eye box, or a combination of both. This is already showing that it has darkening to the image at the higher magnifications. Granted, we're looking at a very white piece of paper, but it's not a very bright conditioned area. Illumination on this thing does get insanely bright, as you already saw in the garage, but it really is that bright. It's nuclear bright, especially with a brand new CR2032 battery inside of it. I truly think people would struggle to find an environment where you'd actually have to use the full capacity of the illumination on this thing. It is insane. Once you start dialing it down, though, the gradients on the adjustment knob is very nice. Everything's evenly spaced, so you should be able to find that perfect brightness setting for you. However, it's still in my very humble opinion that this reticle is useless without the aid of illumination, especially at the lower magnification. The turrets sound and feel really solid. I do wish that the
halfway point on the mils would be marked with a longer hash mark, so you could very easily quick reference that. Beyond that though, these turrets can't be much better. Tracking performance is important on any optic, even ones that have set and forget turrets like this, because if you go to make an adjustment, is it actually going to be that adjustment, or are you going to be just throwing shots downrange for hours on end, just scratching your head? You will note that as I change from one magnification to the next, going up and down or down and up, there is a significant shift to the image, but the reticle does not shift on the target. This was a phenomenon that I had experienced with the Nightforce Attacker 4-16. When I reached out to Nightforce about it, they said most people don't notice that nor even mention it, but it is part of the design. You will note that at the lower magnifications, everything gets really blurry. I had to set the focus on my camera and the optic with the rear diopter to get the reticle and the target to look as good as possible at 41 yards. It's a very less than stellar setup, but it's still going to give us the information that we need to know as far as how this thing is going to track and is there any slop to the erectors. Speaking of slop, I did find that there was a slight amount of slop, about a half a click in between the windage and the elevation. Everything did return to zero, but if you start jockeying it to the right and then go back to the left or up and then down or vice versa, you will have about a half a click of slop. It doesn't ultimately make that much of a difference, but it is something to note. Despite that though, tracking performance on this thing was extremely good. Starting out with our step test to 4 mils over and 4 mils up, you'll see that when we land on that line, it's pretty well squared away. It's pretty solid. And the drops line up to my target basically flawlessly. Adjusting the windage back to zero yields, again, a very good result. And cranking up the elevation to a total of 9 mils on this target will showcase that it's basically bang on. A very solid performance for an optic that you shouldn't really have to adjust your zero on unless you're constantly taking it on and off of your gun. I will die on the hill that the EBR9 is a very flawed reticle. And here's one of the perfect cases in point. Without the aid of illumination in my backyard that has some dark shadowy areas from the way the light is hitting everything, you can't really see where the reticle is at all, let alone the center. Those posts at 3, 6, and 9 are so short that they just disappear off into the wilderness. If those posts were full length, like let's say on the PLxC, for example, it would be much easier to at least focus your eye to find everything in the center. But that is not the case with this, nor is it the case with the DMX reticle from Nightforce. Even though the post at 3, 6, and 9 on that reticle is a little bit longer than what we see here, it still has some major flaws. At 1x though, we have a very flat looking image, which is very surprising to me. Given that this thing is roughly 8.5 inches long and 19 ounces, and a 1-10, I was expecting this to have massive amounts of distortion, but truth be told, it really doesn't. It's an extremely good performing 1x. And the illumination is also extremely good and absolutely necessary. If you were to buy this or a Gen 3 1-10, I highly recommend you stock up on CR2032 batteries and throw a couple in your buttstock or in your range bag, because if it ever goes out and you need it, you are going to be screwed. Now I must mention yet again that my camera setup behind a scope is extremely rigid, and a camera lens versus the naked eye picks up things a little bit differently. You'll also note that there is a big aggressive shadow in the 6 o'clock position. I filmed this segment outside to help illustrate how good the coating on the rear lens is as far as dealing with outside ambient light. You already saw some of that in the garage, and down there it handled itself really well. And out here, yes, you can still see a massive part of the image is being blotched out by the shadows, but it's ultimately not that bad. I have seen worse performances. As far as what my precision tracking target looks like at roughly 75 yards, at 10x, it's not the best. I don't know what the fixed parallax is on this scope. It could be 100 yards, it could be 150, it could even be 200. But at 10x, it definitely doesn't have the best image. 8x is really solid, 6x is really solid, and between 6 and 1, it really has a bit of a gray zone. This isn't the first, the second, or even the third 1-10 first focal plane LPVO that I've reviewed that has that sort of Image deficiency. Usually on most LPVOs in the 1 to 10 range, you're giving up something somewhere. Sometimes you're giving up multiple things. For the Gen 3 Razor, you're giving up image stability, meaning the sharpness of the reticle to the image and vice versa. You're giving up eye box, and you're giving up how good the illumination is visible depending on where you are behind the scope. If you don't have a perfect cheek weld, if you're a little bit too far back from being in a bad position or too far forward from being in the prone, let's say, it will perform differently given all those different inputs. This 1 to 10 is very similar in that regard. I will go over it more later. But right now, let's talk about the low light performance at 1x. It's quite good. And again, you can see just how flat the image is because none of the trees are really moving or shifting. To the naked eye, there is a softness to the outside edge. But again, naked eye versus a very rigid camera setup is going to have a couple of different things going on with it. Just something to note. Lowering the illumination down to level 4, it's still a little bit too bright for this environment. You could see once we crest up to 10x, the image does get significantly darker. I illustrated this when we focused on the reticle, and out here in the field, it's only going to be more relevant, especially considering we're in a very low light environment right now. Eye box in this thing at 10x is extremely tight, even in a good condition. So in a bad condition like this, it's nearly impossible to use. Do not forget, ladies and gentlemen, that in lower light environments, your eye's iris is going to dilate to let more light in. And in more cases than not, your iris will be larger than the exit pupil from the scope, meaning you'll get these really weird shadows, and it's going to be very hard for you to get behind the scope and look through it. At the indicated 6x that we just played around with just now, you saw how fast everything just started falling apart. Here at 2x, it's even worse. In fact, the eye box at 2x seems even tighter than it does at 6, and the image gets really blurry. At 1x, the reticle is about as good as it's going to perform, and you can see that we do have a little bit of shift into the image, but that's going to be on par with almost any 1 to whatever LPVO in the first or second focal plane. There's always going to be some sort of distortion, but this handles itself quite well. I really wish the in-between magnifications of 2, 3, and 4x were much better than they are. So this is going to be something a little bit different. I'm under my deck. I have the Razor AMG on top of my Gen 2 Ruger American, and I wanted to segue this little snippet of video into this review because I really wanted to give you all the best possible sense of what it's like to actually be behind the scope from my words as I'm actually looking through the scope. I apologize for the potential audio quality issues with this. I love running this microphone on my big camera because it really has a very natural tone to it. Unfortunately, you're probably going to be hearing all of the birds, the slight highway noises, and all of the wind, so I apologize for that. Anyway, we've already looked at the scope a lot, but my actual thoughts of, boom, I'm right behind it, how's it going to act and perform is going to be any sort of different. Because, again, the way I record my videos for my reviews is on a very rigid setup. It's not to the naked eye. All of the scopes that I test are set to my eye with the rear diopter, and my camera's focus is set up to that, so it matches it as close as possible, but still the human eye versus a camera lens will perform and react differently to different environments. Well, that being said, the gun is clear, the scope is on 1x, and the illumination is currently off. So, I have some 6x6 posts at about 6 feet, I have a tree at about 15 yards, and my precision paper target down to about 70-75 yards. So plenty of things for us to look at. So with that, let's get my initial take on what it's like to actually get behind this scope. If we go 1x at my 70-yard precision targets and come up, cheek weld is very solid. Eye box on 1x on this thing is very generous. The reticle, the EBR9, is less than stellar, but we've already talked about that. As far as if there's a shift to the image, meaning when we look through the scope, does the image shift up, does it shift down, or does it stay neutral, which is ideal? This does have a slight shift up. If I'm looking at an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper at 70 or so yards, and I go from off the page to just on the page, the edge of the image at 1x to my eye is blurry. Again, this is set as good as possible for this scope. Now, that means it's as good as it's going to be on 1x and 10x and everything in between. I can dial this so it does look better at 1x, but it's going to sacrifice focus and image performance throughout the rest of the magnification range. That's another reason why I don't like these massively over magnified optics. So with that being said, if I go from the target being in view to out of view and back and forth and just shuffle it like this, yes, the outside edge of the image is blurry, but the target does shift up about a half a page, which is not that bad. Typically on every LPVO that I do, there'll be a slight shift. Very, very few will have zero shift. And those are usually the ones that I prefer the most because it gives the most accurate representation of what you're actually looking at downrange. Despite that though, the center part of the image is very sharp and clear and very bright. Again, the outside edge of the image is out of focus to my eye currently, and that's still as good as I can get it. Illumination on maximum is insanely bright, too bright for this environment, despite the fact that it is very sunny outside, but we are looking under a very heavy canopy into the woods. The perfect brightness setting for these conditions for me, where I would still feel confident about knowing where the center is and not having it blossom out, so I know I have a very fine precision point, is brightness setting 5, so less than half of the total brightness on this thing. Illumination on this thing is redonkulous. It's very, very good. But again, as we'll talk about it momentarily, at certain magnifications, it performs better than at other magnifications. Before we get there though, as far as panning across my backyard, do I notice any issues as far as distortion goes? Only because the outside edge does have that softness to it. Beyond that, it's a fairly flat looking image. Very good, all things considered. Color palette on this thing does appear to be a little bit on the cooler side. Not a negative or a positive, it's just something that I note. Some scopes are a little bit warmer, some are a little bit cooler. Very few I find are actually perfectly representative of what we see with the naked eye. Things like tangent thetas. That 525 professional, that illustrated a perfect image color tone to everything. So sometimes you get what you pay for. Again, that was only a 5x multiplier. This is twice that. So again, sometimes more isn't necessarily better. With all that being said, at 1x, it's very, very good. Illumination stays visible all the way out into the shadows, which is what you could at least hope for in this setup scope. Can't expect much more out of a first focal plane optic of any magnification. We're going to bump it up to 2x real quick. This is where optically on the camera it looks like it performs at its worst. And to my eye, it's even worse. If I'm focusing on my 15 or so yard tree, the image is actually quite good. But 70 yards, the image is completely hazy. Lenses are completely clean. It is very humid out here today, but the air quality down here is pretty good, so there's no fog or anything like that. But at 2x, it's a very poor performance, as is the performance with the illumination. Slightly off center, it goes from super bright to off, super bright to off, well before we hit the shadows. It's unfortunate, but that's just the way it goes. 3x is a very similar performance, so I'm not even going to bother with that. I'm going to skip straight up to 4x. And 4x, we have a little bit of the same. The image at 70 yards is not perfectly clear, but again, I don't know what the PLxC setting is set to on this. It could be 100 yards, it could be 150 yards. We're still well within inside all of those settings, but even in much farther conditions, like the shooting range, for example, where it goes out to 300 yards, I still experienced most of the same. The eye box is starting to get pretty tight. Illumination performs a little bit better than it does at 2x, only because the eye box is getting tighter and the illumination is now following suit with the tighter eye box. 6x. So how I know that it's the scope more than my eye or the diopter settings or our distance is from 4x to 6x, the image goes from okay to insanely good. It goes from 1x to 6x. Everything in between has some sort of flaw. But 6x is razor sharp. The eye box is about the same size as it was at 4x, which is very impressive. But the image quality, the sharpness, and the colors are all sensational down there at 70 yards. However, the illumination goes from on to off very quickly. And that's just one of the unfortunate side effects of most first focal plane LPVOs like this, especially with very bright illumination in the first focal plane. Second focal plane scopes do not have that issue. Optically though, this thing is wonderfully sharp and clear, and the view through it is gorgeous. I should also mention that the scope profile that we see to the naked eye varies greatly from what we see on camera. If you've ever been behind a Gen 2 Razor HD 1:6, for example, or even their Gen 3 1:10s, if you get behind them just right, the outside edge of the scope body basically disappears, and you're just left with a floating image inside. It's beautiful. This gets really, really close to that. It's not as good as the 1:6, but it's still very, very impressive. From 6x to 8x, still capable of getting behind the scope fairly quickly, even in an unsupported position, and using it. And I have to say, the 8x almost seems a little bit easier than the 6x, because I was there talking just now, being capable of keeping not only the reticle and the scope and the gun on target, but also being able to see the illumination throughout the entire process. Whereas 6x felt a little bit tighter than this, despite the fact that the 8x is definitely tighter as far as the eye box goes. It's just the overall experience at 8x is pretty solid. Better than one would expect, I would say, myself included. But the real question is 10x. I know this is not a perfect place to test the 10x unsupported, looking into a fairly dark environment at a fairly close range, all things considered, but it's still worth checking out. So, at 10x, the image does look a little bit greasy. The illumination seems pretty stable. The eye box is a little bit on the tighter side. As far as brightness to the image, it's definitely a little bit lower. But again, the naked eye to the camera are two totally different things. And again, our brightness to, well, the ambient light from the sun is still pretty good, all things considered, despite the heavy canopy down there. But the 10x on this performs better than I was expecting it to, all things considered. I can keep on 8.5 sheet of paper and still have a good view of the illumination and the reticle. Nothing is losing sharpness or focus. We just hit the outside edge of the eye box pretty quickly. Again, what do you expect? But it's very stable and it's very solid. If I was to deploy this bipod and get behind any sort of object, or even standing off a vertical post, I would have no problem using this 10x at almost any distance. Just saying. It's wonderful at 10x. Way better than I was expecting. Given the fact that this is so much smaller, so much lighter than the Gen 3, I wasn't expecting a whole lot. But boy howdy, this scope has really opened my eyes to that. I still wish that the in-between magnifications from 1x to 6x were better, but 1x is solid, the 6x is really solid, the 8x is a little bit more solid, and the 10x is very solid. So overall, a wonderfully balanced little optic in a very short package. Let's finally stretch this thing's legs. At 1x here under the power towers, well, you could already see that the image through it looks pretty squared away, pretty solid, pretty representative of what we see outside of it. Look at the legs of those power towers. Everything remains very much in line with very little to no distortion. I did just mention at 75 or so yards, there is a slight shift to the image, all about 4 inches or so. So at these distances, about 30 or 40 yards, we're really not going to pick up that much. At greater distances, we'll pick up a little bit more, but it's not going to matter because if you're at higher magnification, you're going to be zoomed in. The most important magnification for that setting and that sort of issue is going to be 1x. And out here, it really doesn't look like anything is doing anything out of the ordinary. In fact, I really do think this thing at 1x is extremely good. Probably one of the best of the first focal plane 1-10s. Again, despite how short this thing is and how light it is painfully impressive. That EBR9 reticle, though, disappears in the tree line without the aid of illumination. I will die on that hill, folks. And guess what? The owner of this scope agrees that the EBR9 is definitely a weak link. At 1x, everything is sharp and clear, edge to edge, center from real close to the edge of the skyline at about 2,000 yards. As we slowly increase the magnification to maximum here, you do not notice any darkening of the image. Again, that's because this is a very bright, sunny, clear day. These were absolutely perfect conditions to film this scope. At roughly 360 or so yards, everything looks sensational. We have a very large depth of field. Everything is in focus. From those power lines at roughly 200 to that tree line roughly at 500 and everything in between, it is solid. Very little to no chromatic aberration. It's basically as good as you could possibly hope for a scope like this. Backing it down to roughly 4x, we're going to focus on our 1,000-yard target and bring it back up to 10x. And boy howdy, does that just look good. In perfect conditions like this, at greater distances where you'd actually be needing to use the maximum magnification, this thing delivers. I think it performs better than the Gen 3 Razor. I think it performs at least on par with the Vudu 1-10. The March Shorty 1-10, there's no comparison. This is a better overall optic. And yes, that's another hill I will die on. This is as impressive as I have ever experienced with a first focal plane 1-10. I love this thing. Okay, continuing on. Illumination is towards the full end, and we are going to be shifting the camera side to side to check image stability. The illumination here at 10x definitely does wander off quite aggressively, and the reticle stays mostly sharp until we get right to the edge of the image, but the target's downrange looks sensational no matter where we are. And iBox out here, given the very bright environment, really seems to be a little bit more forgiving. At roughly 8x, I feel this thing is about as good as you could possibly get for an optic. A little bit larger eye box than it is at 10x. We still have a fairly tight eye box, again, all things considered, but it is still on the usable side. Illumination shuts off fairly aggressively, but at the higher magnification, the illumination really doesn't matter as much, but if it still matters to you, even here at 6x, you could see just how fast the illumination shuts off. But the image stability on the reticle is very high, and as far as the target's downrange, it's also quite high. Very good performance, all things considered. I'm going to keep on saying that because you should be considering this thing to perform halfway decent despite its size, and it, well, performs a little bit better than that. At 4x, you could see it starts to struggle a little bit. It should be a little bit better than what it is at 4x, or at least so I feel. It's still more than usable, but I would love to see it be improved. At 2x, it's really probably about as bad as you're ever going to get. For a lot of people, it's going to be fine. They probably won't even notice. They probably won't even shoot it at 2x. But to the naked eye, it does look significantly worse than what it picks up on camera. From 1.5 to basically 3.5, it performs about the same. At 1x, though, this thing really is solid. Excellent image stability, excellent illumination visibility, and excellent overall eye box. It really is damn impressive for what this thing is. At 1x, in a more dynamic setting, illumination is set to 5 out of 11, so you can just imagine how much brighter this thing could get. The 1x is, again, like I've mentioned, quite good on this thing. Very impressive, very easy to get behind regardless to your position, and it just makes the overall experience about this thing really, really nice. It's actually one of my favorite things. At 2x, though, is the worst thing. I don't like the 2x, 3x, 3.5x, 1.5x. It just falls apart. But we've seen this on almost every first focal plane 1-10, so why should this be any different, especially considering how small and light it is? I'm going to continue harking on that because it's something that you really need to start understand. 4x down here, the image looks exceptional, but the eye box gets very tight at 4x, and the illumination shuts off pretty aggressively. When you're perfectly behind it, it's doable, it's usable, but I still feel that 6x right here is a little bit better. Given the fact that you're at 2x more, sure, the shadows might creep up, but the shadows are more progressive, so it's not like a solid on and off. But the 6x, I think, is much easier to use than the 4x. Counterintuitive, I know, but if you got behind this, I think you would understand and agree. Moving it up to 8x, and you're going to see that it's going to be tighter. But again, if you have a perfect cheek weld behind this thing, even if you are talking or slightly moving, it's going to be okay. I would still love to see this be a 1 to 8 as opposed to a 1 to 10, because I really think Vortex would have crushed it. Absolutely crushed it in this size and weight category. I think optically a 1 to 10 like this would just be so much better. But I don't know if we're ever going to see that. I think they did make a test optic for the Canadian military. I could be wrong on that fact. Please correct me in the comment section if I am wrong. But I do know that there were talks of a 1 to 8 short LPVO from Vortex. But unfortunately, I don't think we'll ever see it. Let's finally jump into the side-by-side comparisons. On the left will be the AMG for all of these videos, and on the right we're going to start off with the Vortex Gen 3 Razor HD 1 to 10. Now, as far as optically how they look like here at 1x, both of them have very similar views looking through them. Both of them have very similar scope profiles. The reticle being the EBR9 is the exact same between the two. As far as weather conditions, the AMG was filmed on a very bright, hot, sunny day, and the G3 was filmed a little bit cooler conditions and a little bit more overcast. So the images will look a little bit different as far as color tones and everything go. I try to get everything as consistent as possible, but it is quite challenging at times. At 100 yards, the AMG doesn't look like it's as sharp as the G3. It's very clear and plain to see. But beyond 100 yards, everything starts to balance out a little bit between the two. It only has a little bit more sharpness to the image, very plain to see. Colors is more or less a wash. It's really hard to pick up between the two here. But as we start increasing our distance, the AMG starts to close the gap on the Gen 3. At 200 yards, the Gen 3 starts to show up a little bit of chromatic aberration in the high contrast areas, but the center of the image is still very sharp, and the outside is more than acceptable. Some would say, why do I even care about the outside image at 10x at distance? Well, some people really care about it, others not so much. It's just something to point out. The AMG here easily performs on par with the Gen 3 at the very bare minimum. However, the overall experience of using both of these scopes, I have to give it to the AMG. It is shorter, it is smaller. I think the packaging is much nicer. I love the really short throw lever. I love the locking diopter. There's a lot of things I really like with the AMG. The G3, for the price point, I feel should have things like a throw lever already included, either a bolt-on one or one that is already molded into the magnification ring, again, like what we see with the AMG, but it just doesn't. I was expecting a little bit more out of the G3 from the first time I reviewed it, where I don't know if the one that I got was just a dud, but optically that thing was a train wreck. This second one, which was filmed only a few months ago, performs at a much higher level than the first one. The farther we go out at distance, the more and more the AMG impresses. And that's something that I really am a big fan of. You already saw it at 1,000 yards and 2,000 yards. The AMG is just splendid. And that's the distances that you might be using this thing at maximum magnification. Anything less at 8 and 6x, I give it to the AMG over the G3, especially in the image stability department. The only real downside to any of this is good luck buying an AMG. If you really want to stick with a Vortex product, it's got to be the Gen 3. You want to save a little bit of money, but you still want a first focal plane LPVO, and you're okay with it being a 1 to 8. The PLxC, albeit this one being the original first focal plane version, not the RDB, which is coming out very soon. In fact, Primary Arms should be sending me one very soon to get a review on that. This thing comes in at $1,500. The RDB is going to be around $1,800. I don't know what other changes they've made to it other than just really bright illumination. But nevertheless, the PLxC comes in 2 ounces lighter than the AMG, but 3/4 of an inch or so longer at 9.2 inches. Eye relief, field of view, exit pupil are all pretty on par with what we saw with the Gen 3, so roughly on par with what we would see with the AMG. I think the PLxC from 1x to 6x is extremely good. 8x, it definitely gets a much softer image, and unfortunately, the farther out you go, the worse it gets. Reticle, completely subjective on this one. You got to figure out which one you prefer. I much prefer the PLxC reticle. I still wish that the center was not a chevron, but a 1.5 MOA dot. I think that would really draw this thing together. Who knows what Primary Arms will come out with tomorrow? I really don't know. The PLxC is a little bit lighter. It's not as short. Aesthetically, I don't think it's as impressive as the AMG, but as an overall package, it's very solid. Again, with the exception of 8X outside the center. The center at 200 yards on the PLxC is quite good, but outside that donut of death, everything starts to really fall apart. That is the only real weakness of that optic, with the exception of the illumination. Again, Primary Arms has rectified that problem with the RDB. I hope that the optics are a little bit more improved, but only time will tell. Now, I know that these two aren't direct side-by-side competitors, but I wanted to showcase what another smaller, lighter optic can do optically as opposed to the AMG. Given how good the AMG looks overall as the package that it is, it just makes it that much more impressive. The PLxC is capable in a myriad of different environments, but just look at the outside edge at the PLxC at 8X at 300 yards. It really falls apart. The center still maintains a fairly good usable sharpness to the image, but what happens if you wanted to use the drops at distance? It's not going to be very feasible. Now, yes, you can run the PLxC with an exposed elevation turret, but it defeats the purpose of having a reticle like that in a small, lightweight form factor. Not to mention, if you do run the exposed elevation turret on the PLxC, it's going to be non-locking, and if memory serves me correctly, non-zero stop. Definitely apples to oranges in this comparison. For around the same price as the PLxC, you can buy an Eotech Vudu 1-10 in first focal plane. Reticles on both of these are useless without the aid of illumination. I am sorry, but at 1x, 2x, 3x, and even 4x, most of these reticles suck. The difference with the Eotech is it's a bit heavier. In fact, it's basically the exact same weight as the Gen 3 Razor at 21.3 ounces. It's a half inch longer than the Gen 3 Razor at 10.6 inches, and the field of view and eye relief is pretty much on par. The Vudu suffered greatly from image instability issues. Illumination was acceptable, but nowhere near as capable as any of the other options that we've looked at from Vortex. When you were perfectly behind the Vudu, I felt it did offer a very good, usable image. But the second you get slightly off center, especially in the mid-range magnifications, well, everything started to fall apart. The overall experience behind the Vudu is nowhere near as nice of an experience with the AMG. It's that simple. But again, you can still buy the Vudu where you can't buy the AMG. Vudu versus Gen 3 Razor, there's a substantial price savings to be had if you were to go with the Vudu. But I personally would probably stick with the Gen 3 Razor. It's a slightly better package than the Vudu. Both of them are majorly flawed. But honestly, none of them really tickle my fancy like the AMG. Yes, the AMG is flawed in some areas, but where it matters most, 1 and then 6 to 10x, I feel that it does a very good job of keeping its composure and maintaining a high level of functionality. The Vudu, on the other hand, can be a very good, compelling package, but you got to understand its minor shortcomings, which are the illumination is not that great. You have to like push-button illumination, which a lot of people prefer over rheostats, and I could understand that, but I've had better experience with rheostats than I've had with push-buttons, especially with just ease of use and simplicity. Push buttons can get really confusing, especially with the Vudu where you have 3 buttons, on, low, and high, or lower and then raise. It's just, something that you're going to have to learn around. Optically, it's actually pretty close when things are perfect, but when things are not perfect, I think I'd have to give it to the AMG. Again, though, sadly, regardless to how good the AMG might be, you still can't readily get one. And that's really, really sad. But let's say you did want to spend around $3,000 on a 1-10 LPVO. What could you get that is available? Well, the only real option, in 1 to 10 form factor anyway, is the March Shorty Gen 2. This is a dual focal plane LPVO, meaning that there are two different reticles, one in the first focal plane and one on the second focal plane. The not really fiber dot bright illumination is on the second focal plane, meaning that it does not change its scaling as you change magnification. But the first focal plane reticle, which you can just start to make out being this very elaborate, finite sort of Christmas tree style reticle, is on the first focal plane, which does directly correlate its scaling to the magnification. It's the best of both worlds. Unfortunately, this technology is very expensive, which is why this optic, in its current configuration with the Shoryuken, if I'm pronouncing that right, probably not, turrets, is $3,000. You can buy it with capped turrets, which is probably the direction I would go, for about the same price as the Gen 3 Razor. But what you are getting with the Shorty is a very short and lightweight optic. It's the same weight as the AMG at 19 ounces, and it's basically the exact same length as the AMG at 8.4 inches. Field of view is a little bit tighter on the Shorty. The view looking through it's a little bit tighter. The scope profile is much more apparent. Exit pupil seems a little bit smaller with the Shorty, but the overall eye relief is roughly the same. The Shorty, though, I felt was very compromised, despite the fact that it has an adjustable side parallax, dual focal plane reticle. It just doesn't have the overall raw optical performance. And that's the biggest problem, because it should be better than this, but it's just not. And it's unfortunately the same situation with the March 1.5 to 15 in also dual focal plane format. Optically, it just does not impress to the point of justification price-wise. As far as the build quality, the fit, the finish, it goes to the Marches. As good as the AMG might be, the Shorty Gen 2 is sensationally crafted like a fine precision watch. The AMG is no slouch, but it has more of a robustness to it, a little bit more, okay, I'll sacrifice a little bit of fit and finish for a little bit more ruggedness. But the March products are just in a class of their own when it comes to the overall experience of using it. But optically, that experience is definitely subpar. I would save my money and go with something a little bit more forgiving. And on that extremely somber note, ladies and gentlemen, let's get into my final thoughts.
I usually do my voiceovers for my final thoughts and conclusion segment, looking over large bore at 300-ish yards. But instead, I wanted to make this a little bit more special. Again, because this is a very special scope. I just came inside from doing my quick behind the optic talking to you guys to give you my real initial thoughts, or at least what it looks like to actually get behind this thing as quickly as possible. Ultimately, I wasn't too sure what I was expecting from the scope. Given that the Gen 3 razors don't really wow me too much, I wasn't really hopeful that a slightly smaller, shorter version of that optic would be much better. But after having this optic for a couple of weeks and using it a lot, I have to say I really like a lot of what this scope has to offer as opposed to the Gen 3s. Now, is that enough for you to sell your Gen 3 part of your soul and try to find one of these? Probably not. But if you really want something that's super exclusive, well, there's only two of these in public circulation that I know of. This one and one other from a guy on Instagram. Speaking of Instagram, Sean's Instagram is linked down below, so if you want to see more of this optic, you can go check that out there. But I do like a couple of the things that Vortex decided to bring onto the scope. The locking eyepiece, for example, is one thing that I wish was standard across all scopes on the market. But so is something like this little tiny throw lever, in conjunction with the very short throws for the magnification ring, is wonderful. It's probably just over 90 degrees, like around 100, 110 degrees tops. And with that little thumb ramp on top, it makes the overall experience of adjusting your magnification really something. It's very nice. Very, very cool to see. The locking illumination is nothing new. That was going back to the days of the original Gen 2 1 to 6s. but it still has all of its goodness. Good solid feel, good tight lockup, and we have a battery compartment that is separate from the actual mechanics itself. So you could very easily come over here and open it, and you don't have to worry about it. And even if it wasn't, you could still lock it, so opening it would still be a breeze. And the turrets are more than acceptable for the style of optic that this is. As much as I might like this, I still can't help but wonder if Vortex decided to make this a 1:8 as opposed to a 1:10, if it would be much better. I like to think that it would be not only better, but vastly superior to anything else on the market. And that's saying a lot. With scopes like the PLxCs and the attackers out there in the 1:8 magnification range, and the Credos, I can't forget the Credos, because the Credos are still, in my opinion, one of the best optical first focal plane 1:8s available. I really would have loved to have seen Vortex make this in a 1:8. I think there were some options floating around out there for like the Canadian military, but will I ever get one of those? Probably not. But I said the same thing about this. This was really special, and I'm very excited to have had this for as long as I did, and I can't wait to get this review out because I'm not going to diddly-daddle with it. I'm going to actually put everything else on hold just because this thing, I think, needs to be seen by all, if only for the fact that it's so freaking cool. With all that being said, again, a very huge thank you to Sean for sending this in for review. This came from the land of Magnum PI, and no, not the new version, I don't even count that, the Tom Selleck version. This came from Hawaii, and I now have to ship this very expensive scope back to Hawaii. So you can imagine how expensive the shipping is going to be, not only for myself, but for Sean, who sent this in. So Sean, I cannot thank you enough. With all that being said, Vortex, if you're watching, why not make this a 1:8? Please. I bet it would be tremendously wonderful. So on that, thank you all very much for watching. As always, I'll see you again next time.
And a huge thank you to my Patreon providers and my Subscribe subscribers. Without you, this truly wouldn't be possible. If you'd like to support my channel but don't want to join either of those, I completely understand. But you could still help by using my affiliate links in the description below, and or like, share, and subscribe as always. Again, thank you very much.